No, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Himakshi. Thank you, Doc, for the very kind introduction. I have a confession actually. I forgot what I was supposed to speak about. Somebody mentioned it to me a long time back. And I've been traveling. I just landed about an hour ago from Madurai and I've already spoken 3 times this morning. So I'm a bit confused. So, if you tell me what is of interest, I'll try and speak. Yeah.
So the title was Politics of Inclusive Development, but in that
Okay.
what would be helpful is to just talk about how to bring that professional rigor into politics with really the scale, but without forgetting the people that we are trying to serve. We can just start with that, but then I'm sure we have a lot of questions.
Okay. I think it's worth touching the original topic as well. So why don't I start with that? Right. I've been, I think, speaking maybe like 2-3 times a week on various forums. It helps you when you have to talk, and good or bad, I don't have the time to prepare. So whenever I get a chance to talk, I talk, from here and from here. And you keep talking often enough and it kind of clarifies things for you. So what I've said very recently multiple times is politics is politics, administration is administration. These are two completely different things, unfortunately. The design of democracy makes a fundamental assumption. It assumes that those who are good enough to get elected or, what do you say, popular enough to get elected are also inherently competent enough to run a government. Unfortunately, that's not true at all. I'm not sure it ever was true, and it is becoming exceedingly kind of not true. If you look at the skills that are required to be given a seat in a major party and to win an election, let's say on my experience in Tamil Nadu, those skills have very little overlap, if any, with the skills required to be a good legislator, let alone a good minister. And then being a good minister is much, much harder than being a good legislator. So, somewhere in the fundamental construct, we have this disconnect. And, if you take that to the next step, you say, what are the skills required to be a good administrator? Maybe we can work backwards from that. Maybe we have a US type model where once somebody wins election as president, they get to appoint whoever they want as the cabinet, irrespective of whether they got elected or not. But at least in India, I'm not sure about the US, though I lived there for 20 years, but in India we have a fundamental problem without naming names. If you look at the members of the cabinet, particularly in this government, but also in the UPA government, those who come through the kind of indirect election route like the Rajya Sabha, they have some profound disconnect with the people, and that's not healthy for a democracy either. As much as I say that professional skills, understanding of systems, administrative capability is important to be a minister or to run the government, much, much more important than all that is a connect with the people. If you have an understanding of their lives, if you have empathy, if you have compassion, and if you tailor your actions based on your understanding of the world, that is a much more effective and consequential kind of outcome. Now, maybe we need a bit of all. Maybe we need a few Manmohan Singhs who are so sophisticated and so clear in policy making that it doesn't matter that they weren't elected. And then we need a few, Lalu Yadavs who are so connected to the people that it doesn't matter what he does or doesn't know about administration, he's going to get things done and he understands the zeitgeist. So, he has impact. But broadly speaking, we have this disconnect. And why I bring this up is I say most of us are playing on the edges. If you look at the consequences of policy decisions or the outcomes relative to the date in which the decision was taken. There's this huge gap, right? I mean, outcomes. It's like the markets. I spent a lot of time in the markets. The markets go up, the markets go down. Everybody tries to interpret why the markets are going up or why they're going down. But at the core, we know that there are so many variables that drive markets that we are all just guessing. I mean, some are more educated guesses than others. Some are better retrospective kind of fitted solutions than others. But at the end of the day, hundreds of variables determine outcomes, and we control a few and we understand a few more, and that's all there is. So if you look at policy, it's even worse because the complexity of the system is so high that the ability to do cause and effect analysis is almost zero, except in rare cases where you have unique individuals who make kind of very, very, what can I say, Six Sigma away from the norm decisions. Like an individual takes it upon himself that he understands economics and will call, demonetization in a few hours' notice. Those are very easy to analyze the consequences of, but most people don't make decisions like that. Most people don't, with advisors of 3 or 5, make earth-shattering decisions. So if it's a normal democratic process where you have to go through, the inputs and the discussions and the committees of the Lok Sabha and then, many cabinet meetings, and by the time you get it voted and come, first of all, there may be a gap between the original intent and the final law or the bill. And second, by the time the implications or consequences of that action are really understood, it may be diluted or it may be affected by half a dozen other things that you don't understand. So we have a system where we think we're going to achieve some outcome and we think we're going to, get some benefit. And so we legislate or design policy or design schemes to achieve that outcome. There are structural limitations in getting that done. And then there are practical limitations, like how much of the money actually gets spent for the purpose we wanted, and how much of it gets taken out in rent seeking and inefficiency and failure. Every year, the CAG report points out hundreds of cases where the money has not been spent as it was intended, either not spent at all, or misspent, or accounted for, wrongly accounted for. So the bad news is that most of the time we're kind of groping in the dark. We think we know what we're doing. We act as if we do. But in fact, at a very technical, scientific, rigorous analysis, you'd be hard pressed to kind of come out with a good cause effect or this resulted in that. What you can do, however, is look at things over the long term. And if you look, earlier today I was at a function in Madurai where somebody talked about a speech that Steve Jobs had given at Stanford about connecting the dots, about looking at outcomes and then looking back and trying to figure out how did we arrive at this place. So if we do a connect the dots exercise, then it's very clear that Tamil Nadu in particular and South India in a broader context had a very interesting and divergent kind of political philosophy right from the 1920s. The 1919 Montague-Chelmsford reforms, some of you may know, was the second attempt at trying to stave off full independence. The first one was in the late 1880s or early 1890s. It was called the Morley-Minto reforms to try and give Indians a bit of a voice in administration. It didn't amount to much. That didn't pacify the independence movement. So the second attempt was the Montague-Chelmsford reforms, and that called for diarchy or two-level government. The British would run the kind of higher level government, keeping all the important topics like revenue, home, all of those things. And then they would give the social sectors to the Indians, elected Indians, and those were like public works, education, all the cultural things, and so forth. And so in Dayaki, the Justice Party, which, of course, I have a conflict of interest because my great granduncle, my great grandfather died young. My great granduncle, who raised all of us effectively as the head of the joint family, was one of the founding charter subscribers of something called the South Indian Liberal Federation, which became the Justice Party. And so they had a very clear view that societal reform was as important, maybe even more important than independence. So when they participated in the process in the 1920 election, the Congress Party boycotted those elections. So they basically swept to power. And in the space of 6 or 7 years, they laid the seeds for what I would consider are the profound differences that make Tamil Nadu a bit unique today. That is, in the space of 6 or 7 years, they did the right to vote for women. So 50% of the population that has been disenfranchised was enfranchised. Compulsory elementary education for boys and girls. Compulsory education. When they couldn't enforce compulsory education because violation rates were 60-70%, in Madras Corporation they started feeding the kids as a way of enticing poor kids to come to school. So they started the first free food program in 1921. They did a lot of analyses that showed that jobs were very tightly controlled by the upper caste in general and the Brahmin community in particular. And using those statistics, they passed what was called the communal geo, which was job reservation based on the percentage of the population. Whatever your community was of the total population, then that percentage of jobs in the public works department, in the revenue administration, in the judicial service, in the legislative assembly were reserved for you. And they did a whole, they removed, for example, I spoke earlier today at a very big hospital that was hosting the annual Indian Association of Toxicology or something, which is some subset of medicine in the emergency department. And the chairman of the hospital said, neither me nor my father, who founded this hospital, would have existed as doctors, and we wouldn't have this hospital if there wasn't a Dravidian movement. Because what the Dravidian movement did in 1923 was remove Sanskrit as a prerequisite to study medicine. Till then, you had to show Sanskrit proficiency to get admission to medical college. So only when that was removed, people who were not otherwise, with easy access to Sanskrit training could become doctors. So, if I was to put the whole package together and call it something today, I would call it inclusive growth, what my chief minister keeps repeating. We want every section of the society to participate in this. And, I'm sure the questions will be more interesting, so I don't want to speak for too long, but I will just say that if you take a broad basket of indicators, that is from per capita income, average education, number of doctors per 1,000 people, access to healthcare, therefore the inverse, which is low infant mortality, low maternal mortality, low malnutrition, number of toilets per people, number of community halls per people, per town. If you take any broad measure that includes human development plus social development plus economic development, then there is no large state that is within sniffing distance of Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu stands all alone by itself. And I'll give you the nearest contrast. If you compare Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, Gujarat has about 10,000 rupees per person, meaning per capita income higher than Tamil Nadu. It is a huge success story economically. In the last 10 years, they have zoomed past Tamil Nadu from a much lower level. That's the economic success story. But if you look at two other indicators, one, the Gini coefficient. What is the extent of spread of poor to wealthy? Gujarat is much, much worse than Tamil Nadu. If you look at the percentage of girls below 15 that are in school, it's almost 100% in Tamil Nadu. It's only about 80% in Gujarat. If you look at the number of doctors per thousand residents, it's almost 4 in Tamil Nadu. That's higher than in the United States. And it's probably one doctor for every 2,500 to 3,000 people in Gujarat. So economic growth can come in multiple ways. It doesn't always come inclusively. Economic growth can come with great disparity as well. So I would say broadly, we are a different breed. From our inception, it has always been about empower. Now, there may be negative consequences. Nothing comes free. I'm happy to talk about those. But the inclusive growth model has lasted effectively 100 years. All but 30 years, Tamil Nadu, its predecessor Madras state, its predecessor Madras presidency, were governed by parties that at least professed to adhere to the South Indian Liberal Federation's value system. The 30 years in between, it was administered by various Congress governments between 1937 and 1967. In those 30 years, the Congress of Madras Presidency and Madras State actually hewed closer to the Justice Party Dravidian value system than they did to the rest of India's Congress. For example, this emphasis on education was doubled down by the Congress government, by Kamraj. He actually invested a lot more in education than in free food. Even something like democratization of religion. What the Justice Party did after multiple attempts was nationalize the kings and emperors' temples. So they thought that when the Congress came 10 years later, they would denationalize them. Not only did they not denationalize them, they went even more aggressively. Rajaji signed the Dalit Temple Entry Act and enforced the full access all the way to the inner sanctum sanctorum for Dalits. My granduncle, Bhaktavachalam, who was a Congress, then HRC minister, then chief minister, was the one who passed the law that the prayers, the archanas could be said in Tamil so that people could understand what was being said in the temples. So the Congress party's policies adhered much more closely to the Dravidian values in Madras Presidency and Madras State. And so I think, blips will come and go. I've been a critic in 5 years as an opposition MLA about the financial mismanagement and the administrative problems. After all of that, Tamil Nadu's GDP has almost tripled in 10 years. It could be a lot better, but it's still. See, when you build up advantages over 50, 60, 80, 100 years, those things are not erasable or losable in 5 years or 10 years. And if you don't have them, then it's not fixable in 5 years or 10 years. I guess that's the overarching theme I'm trying to say. If you get the fundamentals right and you get it right long enough, then that's a sustainable kind of advantage. And if you don't get the fundamentals right, everything else you do, you pump in money. And I've had this discussion with Mr. M.K. Singh when he came as the Finance Commission chairman. He said the goal of the Finance Commission was to do devolution, which is take the integrated tax money of India and split it up both vertically, the union to the states, and horizontally between the states under three principles: transparency, equity, and efficiency. And I said transparency, let's not argue. Of course, everybody's for transparency. What's the definition of equity and what's the definition of efficiency? These are not easily definable terms. So I said, let me propose that equity means that there should be some kind of correlation. Of course, the poorer should get more and the richer should get less, and therefore there should be net transfers from the rich to the poor. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But beyond that, there should be some kind of incentive for performance. If I achieve the goals that you ask me to, I mean, and they have all these metrics, right? They say for achieving population control, for achieving this revenue gap closure, all this stuff. But in fact, you have not done a good job. You meaning not Mr. Singh, but the last 15 finance commissions. And if efficiency is to be the basis, I said anywhere else in the world you look, Europe, China, US, efficiency means that when you transfer net funds from the well off to the less well off, that transfer should reduce the gap, should lower the gap. That's the whole point of transfer. I take money from the rich and give it to the poor. Government does that all the time. It does that within a district, it does that within a state, it does that within a federal country, and aid agencies do that around the world. But the effect of that is supposed to be that you have less inequality, greater convergence. 15 finance commissions, we're keeping on transferring greater and greater amounts, and we're keeping on getting not just not convergence, but accelerating divergence. Right? The best to the worst used to be 2:1, let's say, at independence. It was probably 4:1 before the reforms. Now sometimes it's 10:1 within the same country, two different states. And the transfers have gotten more and more aggressive. At one point in Tamil Nadu, if we gave in 1 rupee of taxes to the union, we got back 75 paisa. Then it was 60, then it was 50, now it's 35. And yet we are going faster and somebody else is not going. So something is structurally wrong. So I said to him, why don't you, instead of incentivizing all these post hoc measures like what is your per capita GDP, which you cannot control anyway, why don't you say that those who get 100% of girls into school will get additional money? Those who have participation of women in the workforce will get it. Because we know, that's about the first indicator that you have progress is to get equal rights and equal opportunities to 50% of the population. So, he didn't particularly take it, but this is the overarching lesson that I would say I take from this is that you have to do the fundamental things right, and you have to do them right long enough. And if you do that, then nothing else matters. And if you don't do that, then everything else cannot save you. You're still going to be stuck in a rut and you're just fixing, today's firefighting and tomorrow's band-aid.